I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we doing today, Rob?
Today, we're doing Du Fu, one of the two sort of undisputed heavyweights of Chinese poetry.
I once heard someone say that, so there are two main poets, Li Bai and Du Fu. And I once heard someone say, if you like Li Bai more than Du Fu, you are not a great person. And I am not a great person.
You heard that for real?
Yeah.
Wow.
I think that was Stephen Durant here at the University of Oregon.
Really?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Well, it's interesting, though, because as we'll talk about, we're doing a two-parter here. This is going to be about Du Fu, and the second one's going to be about Li Bai.
Our first multi-part podcast.
Stay tuned for the next episode. But these two together are in many ways emblematic of a lot of of a certain polarity in Chinese culture that frankly exists fully formed even now. You and I both lived in China for various lengths of time.
Yeah. The romanticist versus the kind of
sort of realist. This, if you've taught English in China for any length of time, for example, or even just hung out with Chinese people, you'll notice this sort of dual desire where it's like there's a desire to break out of all constraints, of all exams and family requirements and everything, and travel the world and see. But conflicting with that is an equally deep desire to simply be settled, to have a good life, a life with a career and a family in a good location where your kids are taken care of. It's in some ways kind of a universal duality. It's not just a Chinese thing. But
I think before we were recording, I mentioned that it's sort of, in a very weird way, the Confucian versus the Taoist.
Yeah.
And that's a very loose analogy.
Very loose.
Don't staple that to any text or anything.
But it does hold some water when you read someone like Zhuangzi, who used to love to make fun of how boring Confucius was, where Zhuangzi himself, one of the foundations of Zhuangzi's philosophy was not learning, like not going to school. Like, you don't need that. There's a certain natural way that things work, and the real sage simply goes out and, experiences it, does it.
Butcher Ting.
What?
Butcher Ting.
That's it. Butcher Ting?
Yeah, Butcher Ting. That's a famous passage in the Zhuangzi.
I don't think I'm familiar with that.
We'll take you to a meat cleaving class.
The next podcast will be at a butcher shop. Okay, we'll talk about Zhuangzi. Yeah.
Oh man, that's gonna sound really good.
Yeah, it is gonna sound really good. That hammer chop on the table. So, but today we're talking about Du Fu.
Right.
And it is interesting. What you mentioned earlier, if you like Li Bai, you're not a great person, that sort of thing. But it is interesting because
there is definitely a feeling in a lot of aspects of Chinese society that I've encountered where you have to like Du Fu. He's the best. But everybody still likes Li Bai a lot more.
There's something appealing about this. And as you read their poetry, you do see some truth to this. Where Li Bai is the wild, drunken, Bacchic sort of character.
Li Bai supposedly died on the Yangtze River, I believe, trying to toast the moon while he was just totally wasted. I mean, that's legend.
But it's a good example of how we talk about Li Bai and his sort of self-promotion. That could actually be true. Yeah. I would not be surprised.
Or it could just be a great story that he...
Either way.
Yeah.
But reading these two together, these two are undisputed masters of the kind of poetry being written in the Tang Dynasty, which was the golden age for classical Chinese poetry.
In some ways, they define Chinese poetry itself.
Yeah.
These guys are the two heavyweights. We should also mention that there is a guy named Wang Wei who's oftentimes mentioned as a sort of triumvirate of Tang Dynasty poetry. But Wang Wei is not that good, and we're not going to pay that much attention.
Wang Wei, in some ways, does not as good what Du Fu does. That's just a feeling.
And he's more of a Buddhist, whereas Du Fu is more Confucian, or something.
So to situate ourselves historically and culturally, the Tang Dynasty goes from roughly 618 to 907. It is basically considered by Chinese scholars themselves anyway, in the mainland anyway.
Certainly all Chinese people, if you ask them to point to a place where, like, hey, when was China the best? They'd all say
Tang Dynasty.
Exactly.
Which is curious, and we'll talk about this more, but because in terms of poetry, it's hard to argue with that. For as much as I love some of the more chaotic older poems, like from the Chu Tzu, it's hard to dispute this. This is just a phenomenally beautiful period for poetry. It is also a phenomenally violent period, which is also intriguing, that this golden age of Chinese culture was also intensely violent and chaotic.
There's an expansion of markets in this period. There are some periods where it's an expanded amount of stability and kind of a Pax Tong. But there are definitely, I think I may have coined a term.
Pax Tong, I like it.
There are definitely some periods that are quite violent. And the period that we're going to be looking at today, the poem we're looking at today, is about a time that's very, very violent.
So let's get into it. What's the poem called in Chinese, and what's the English translation?
The Chinese poem's name is I Wang Sun. And the English translation is The Lamentable Prince, or Lament for the Prince, or
the
something
Unfortunate
like,
Prince.
Unfortunate Prince, something like that. Should we just go ahead and read it out in English?
Go ahead and read your English. This is Lee's translation. He did a little bit of work on this in a previous term.
Lifetime.
Previous lifetime. Terms are like lifetimes. So go ahead and read your translation.
Sure. So it's a little long, about 28 lines, so I hope y'all will stick with it. The Lamentable Prince. White-headed crows atop the walls of Chang'an. At night, they fly atop welcoming autumn gate, cawing. They also go towards people's houses, pecking at the great roofs. Beneath the roofs, the high officials run to avoid the barbarians. Golden whips were broken, the 9 horses dead. Flesh and bones do not wait, but with the horses gallop. Precious jade hanging on his waist, its color that of blue coral. The pitiful prince cries on the street corner, asking him. He is unwilling to tell me his name, but he tells me of his hardships and begs to be a slave. He is already hidden in the thorns for 100 days. The skin and muscles are so lacking on his body. The children of Emperor Gao have all have prominent noses. The seeds of the dragon is different from that of the ordinary people. The jackals and wolves are in the city, the dragons in the wilderness. Prince, take good care of your precious body. I don't dare speak too long with you, facing the crossroads. But I will stand here for the moment, for the sake of the prince. Last night the east wind blew with a stench of blood. From the east, camels filled the old capital. The northern army was strong and martial. Before, how brave and strong they were, and now how clumsy. I have heard that the emperor has already abdicated. The holy virtue of the north has subdued the southern Shanyu. At Huamen, the slashed faces beg to give vengeance. But we must be cautious not to say too much. Their people lie in wait. Alas, prince, do not become estranged. The 5 tombs, auspicious air. May there be no time you are without it.
This is an intensely sad poem, as you may have picked up.
Yeah.
It takes place, Du Fu wrote it in 756, shortly after the occupation of Chang'an by An Lushan.
And it's not clear whether or not, I mean, when he wrote this, how much of this he actually knew. We can confirm most of the historical facts that the emperor had abdicated at this point, but it's not clear how much Du Fu actually knew, right?
Right. As is the case with most Du Fu poems. He's not the sort of self-promoter Li Bai was, but he certainly draws freely on other sources without saying where he got them. But the event that forms the narrative spine for this poem is the An Lushan rebellion in 756. So what exactly was that?
So An Lushan was a non-Chinese ethnic minority. He was also a general in the Tang Dynasty army, and there was a contention between him and a member of the court, and this member of the court essentially tried to have him fired. And when you fire a guy with a big army behind him, you have to be very, very careful. He knew that if he was fired, he probably would be killed. So he instead decided to lead his troops on an invasion of China, or of China proper, an attempt to topple the dynasty and conquer it. He did actually invade. He conquered Luoyang fairly easily, and that's at this time the eastern capital. And he invaded Chang'an, the main capital where the emperor sat, without too much trouble. Eventually, partially because of the incompetence of one of the court official who he was having a problem with, Yang Guozheng, I believe. And essentially there was just a bureaucratic fight that became a very political and military fight, and just resulted in huge amounts of bloodshed, and it forever changed the Tang. Afterwards, the Tang was never the same.
Right. Some would say that the Tang never recovered from this. The Song dynasty, it's still a good 150 probably years away, but from the foundation of the, or from the end of the Tang.
The end of the Tang.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But the Tang arguably never really recovers from this.
Yeah, because of what happened and the deals that had to be made during the An Lushan Rebellion, power was moved from a centralized location to a decentralized location. So warlords kind of increasingly took power. And
it arguably alters Du Fu's life completely as well.
Absolutely.
Before the rebellion, Du Fu was not perhaps a chief member of the court or even the civil service, but he's got a good position. He's well regarded. After this, he's nobody. He has to flee with everybody else and spends over a decade trying to get back to the emperor, who is no longer in Chang'an.
And we should point something out here. Though this may seem obvious, I think sometimes people look past it. Du Fu doesn't actually know what's happening in the future.
It's true.
He doesn't really get that things are necessarily falling apart when he's writing this poem. He's writing it on the fly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Very much. I mean,
which is one of the reasons why Du Fu is often considered, one of the labels that gets attached to him is a historical poet.
What does that really mean?
It's one of those wonderful terms that you'll read in Chinese literary scholarship.
Yeah.
Where no one really defines it. It sort of loosely means that he wrote about history in his poems.
Yeah. Or things that became history.
Or things that became history.
I guess to him they weren't history.
Right, no. But it is true that he writes a great deal more about current events than Li Bai does. You, for example, in this poem, if you haven't read a great deal about the An Lushan Rebellion, you can still get a pretty good idea
that things were going on that was really not good.
Yes, and what's interesting about the presentation is that Du Fu isn't a third-person omniscient narrator.
He's right in the mix.
He's right in the mix of it, and he's sort of hidden away. Like, who exactly is he describing in this poem?
So, right around line 7, he starts talking about this precious jade hanging on the waist. That actually is referring to a prince who he runs into while on the outskirts of the capital. He finds this prince who's been hiding in the woods in the thorns for 100 days, trying to avoid An Lushan's troops. But he's so recognizable that when he's starving and has to come out of hiding, the concern is that he's going to get caught very quickly.
Yeah, and what's been happening to his family in the meantime?
They've all been killed.
They've all been killed.
Unless they escape.
Right.
Which, the lines 5 and 6, the golden whips were broken, the 9 horses dead, flesh and bones do not wait, but the horses gallop. That actually is a reference to something that's going on. Apparently the emperor took off without a lot of his family, so this is sort of an implied criticism of what the emperor did, just taking off really quickly. And I think this princely figure is sort of the embodiment, the literal embodiment of that criticism, because so they took off so fast that the whips were broken and some of the horses were whipped so much that they were killed. They didn't even have time, supposedly, to take them off of the carriages. They just kept going with those dead bodies hanging there. But if there was not enough time for that, I mean, like if there really wasn't enough time, they just completely left all of these. If it's almost like a sort of bad planning. Like if they had enough horses to whip some of them to death,
right?
Then why not actually just not whip those horses to death and leave them for this prince to escape? He's going to be killed. He's going to have his head cut off or whatever. Right. His ending. There's no illusion in this poem. This doesn't have a happy ending.
No, it doesn't. And this is one of the things, though, that makes Du Fu such a fascinating and beautiful poet, is his ability to compress so much detail into a very small, constrained space. Like this poem starts out with Li's translation, "White-headed crows atop the walls of Chang'an." Now, it doesn't even matter what you know about Chinese culture. If you read a poem that starts out with crows sitting on a city wall, you know something bad is happening or is going to happen, period.
And so I should explain that illusion. That is actually a reference to an earlier invasion by a non-Chinese group to a smaller capital city. But I think you're right. One of the great things about Du Fu is you don't have to know these illusions. These illusions are there for you to kind of dig deeper, but it's not really that important.
Right. And Du Fu has a way of presenting details in such a way that you have to infer the larger picture, but it's not hard to infer the larger picture. Mm-hmm. Like here, all we see is a sketch of a prince. And we don't read, there's no final line saying, and then everyone died, or something that there's simply a sketch, literally a physical sketch of this prince. Li's got lines in here to describe him, where it says, "He has already hidden in the thorns for 100 days. The skin and muscles are so lacking on his body." Just those two lines, you're aware that this is desperate. This is a kid.
And you really see the kid who's like
yes.
kind of just having so much trouble.
And if you're asking, if you're investigating Chinese literature, especially for the first time, and you're wondering why do people read Du Fu, first of all, kudos to Li for the translation, because Du Fu is unbelievably hard to translate. Partly because of so much detail compressed into a small space. He is in some ways a little bit like, we talked about this, Li and I, before, like Johann Sebastian Bach, in the sense that Bach worked within very, very tight musical constrictions. There's a way to execute a fugue. There's a way you're supposed to write certain things, but he excelled within those forms so well that he doesn't feel like he's constrained by anything. Doesn't even seem like he's using a form. And so Du Fu does the same thing. Whatever poetic idiom he's working in, he observes the conventions and yet manages to observe them so well that it's sort of like you can't even tell he's doing it. This one, for example, is what we would call a gushi. At that time would be a gushi, an old-style poem, sort of like a ballad.
Mm-hmm. And gushi is not really, I mean, there are regulations associated with gushi. So I don't think you should think of it as necessarily more. I mean, they're all pretty freaking old.
Yes, but this is sort of just the term they use for it. Yeah. But this is one of the reasons, one of the things that makes Du Fu both very different from Li Bai and often considered by literary scholars to be superior, because this is somebody who was clearly so aware of how the poetry of the time worked that he could stay completely within the restrictions and perfect them.
How much of that sort of assigned greatness that Du Fu gets do you think is just because he's so elusive? He's always alluding to something, whereas Li Bai, Du Fu, for the listener, Du Fu seems much more unapproachable. Like this poem, sure, you can understand that something bad is going on by seeing the white-headed crows, but do you really understand unless you know that the white-headed crows is referring to something in the Liang dynasty or something like that? Like, I mean, does it make as much sense? Like, That's one of the things I think I love about Li Bai is that you don't need that. And I think that may be why he is liked a lot more by non-Chinese people who study Chinese poetry, whereas Du Fu is liked more by, and I don't want to say by Chinese people, because Chinese people love Li Bai, I think, more.
Yes. Or equally, anyway.
I feel like there's a lot more affection for Li Bai, and people are a lot more willing to memorize his poems. But Du Fu, I think you're right, in the academia, in the sort of elite, he's considered the best, even if he's not the most loved.
And you make a really good point about his allusions, because Lee and I have both read a little bit, at least, about the Anlushan Rebellion. If you haven't read anything, this is going to still be a really hard poem to read, because you'll get, okay, the prince is clearly in trouble. Why is he in trouble? What is going on? Like, you'll get a general sense of something bad, but not much else. And there are other Du Fu poems where so much is compressed in a single line that there's literally no way to understand it unless you know specifically what it's referring to.
It's almost impossible to translate.
Yes.
I mean, the footnotes take up 10 times the amount that the poem does.
Yeah. And to that extent, and to, in that sense, if you are interested in learning about Chinese culture and history, find a good copy of the poems of Du Fu with some footnotes, because you'll get a fascinating history and culture lesson.
Yeah. What translation or what book are you using?
The book that Lee and I both have, I think, enjoyed the most with Du Fu is by the great Chinese scholar and translator David Hawkes, Hawkes, called A Little Primer of, he says Tufu, Tu-Fu.
That's just Du Fu in a different transliteration system.
David Hawkes is one of the giants in Chinese studies in the 20th century.
Yes, but I don't think that you need to be thinking about that if you're looking at this book.
No,
I mean,
definitely not.
It's not at all. This book is not at all intimidating.
No.
It's very approachable.
And I think that is what impresses me the most about it.
Good scholarship that's approachable.
It's incredible scholarship. It's amazing translation. It's a short book. It's not, it's not even
200
the actual
pages.
poems take up like 209 pages with all the explanations, translations, everything.
Yeah.
And in those 209 pages, you get a guided tour of Du Fu. And I really think his translations are so accomplished, you'll understand, at least to some extent, why people read Du Fu. So it's a really good way to learn about the culture, that's for sure.
Yeah, we'll try and put it up for a link to it on the podcast.
The Amazon link or whatever. So let's kind of to kind of lead out of this, because we're coming up on about a half hour here.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Du Fu now. We haven't given much of a biography. That's partly intentional. We want you to think more about the poetry than the actual life. But in terms of his biography, the salient points are that he's kind of a normal guy, right? And I mention that because when we talk about Li Bai is the exact opposite.
He's not normal.
Li Bai is the carouser. He's the Jim Morrison of the Tang Dynasty.
I don't know. I guess for me, like, Li Bai seems more normal in some ways. Just like as if you measure normalness as like guy you would like to have a beer with.
Oh, yes, I'd rather have a beer with Li Bai, but I wasn't aware that was our scale.
Du Fu is normal in that he's boring.
Yeah, that's probably a better word. I think if we were to hang out with Du Fu, we would all go, geez, where's Li Bai? Let's bring him in here. But no, Du Fu has a lot of poems about just being at home, wishing he was at home, wishing he could have a job, things like this. Sweeping. I think he does have a poem, or mentions it anyway. Just sweeping. Like, really? That's what you're talking about? He has such a wide range that we forget that his life was exciting only because
he lived in exciting times.
Exactly.
In that old, not a Chinese proverb that everybody
may you live in interesting times.
Yeah, he lived in interesting times.
But to lead into the next podcast, we're dealing with a poet, Du Fu, who is undeniably a master of most of the poetry idioms up to the Tang Dynasty. And when I say master, I mean someone like Bach who could employ them so well that you really don't even know he's doing it. And yet if you were to really break it down, you would see syllable by syllable. It's just perfect. You can't think of how you could possibly do better than this.
And I think that's one of the reasons he's so loved by the critics. Is he's the critics' poet.
Yes.
He does things so perfectly, and his form is so great.
Right. But we'll be talking about Li Bai next time. And Li Bai does not do this. He is the master of the idiom in the sense that he's going to kind of mess with it however he wants. He doesn't feel like he has to do certain things in order to stay within the rhyme scheme or the meter.
Mm.
He'll toy with it. He'll have a line that's way too long, where Du Fu would never do this, or at least that I'm aware of. I'm not exactly a Du Fu scholar, but this is sort of the reputation of the two guys. So,
you want to call that a wrap?
Let's call it a wrap. Next time we talk about the Tang Dynasty, we'll be talking about Li Bai. So,
all right.
I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.